In part two on this topic of Galen Strawson's arguments against the existence of moral responsibility, in fact, he argues that moral responsibility is impossible, regardless of how the world is, regardless of whether determinism or indeterminism is true. And so now we look at some of the responses that Strawson himself considers. And there are three broad general categories of free will, approaches to free will, that Strawson considers. The first is that of compatibilism. So a compatibilist says that you can be morally responsible even if determinism is true, even if you don't have alternatives. And so one is truly responsible when one acts only if there are no internal or external constraints. So the internal constraints would be things like a neurosis or being hypnotized or threatened. And here the borderlines between internal and external get somewhat blurry. If you're threatened, that's external, but you do something out of fear, that seems to be internal. But in any case, the external force would obviously be external, the neuroses obviously internal, and then there's a spectrum between those. So as long as you don't have those, says the compatibilist, then you can be truly responsible for what you do. Now, you can have that, again, this compatibilistic moral responsibility, even if you're fully determined. And so the second step, the second premise of the more formal basic argument is false. That premise was to be truly responsible for what you do, you must be truly responsible for having your nature from which you do it. And so the compatibilist says that that's false. Now, Strawson responds and says, well, wait a minute. One cannot be truly responsible if everything that one does is either because of the way one is, well, I should say and, not either, because of the way one is, which it seems like the compatibilist might agree with that still, and no one can be ultimately responsible for the way one is. So Strawson doesn't really see this as a significant challenge. He says you still have the same regress problem. Now, I won't attempt to respond on behalf of the compatibilists because I'm less sympathetic to that point of view, but I'm sure that someone like Fisher could have much more to say there. Now, on the libertarian concern, so we've had the compatibilist, the libertarian. The libertarian responds to Strawson by saying, for example, Bob Kane, if one is morally responsible, or we might even say truly responsible, only if one has the power to make choices, which can only and finally be explained in terms of one's own will. So we have this criterion for being morally responsible. And then Kane goes on to say, and there are such cases. There are times when this criterion is met. And so there are cases of indeterminism that include these self-forming actions, is what the SFA there is. And so we are truly morally responsible in those cases. Now, if that's the case, the first step of the basic argument is false, which says you do what you do in any situation because of the way you are in that situation. So Kane says, well, you still have options given the way that you are. You could do one thing and you could do something else because you can act during this indeterministic time and have a self-forming action. So Strawson responds to this by appealing to something like what Kane called the luck principle. This is a broad principle that people have brought against a libertarian view of moral responsibility or free will more broadly. And that is, if indeterminism is the case, and you're building that into somebody's actions, then that means that there's luck or chance involved in your actions, and that means that there is not any moral responsibility. So if you have indeterminism, then what you do is really a matter of luck or chance, and you're not morally responsible. If it wasn't luck, then the self-forming actions occur only due to previous character, argues Strawson. And even if that was formed by prior self-forming actions, of course, they were also dependent on prior character and so on. And you get the regress going in terms of the self-forming actions. And so Strawson argues that including indeterminism simply introduces chance or luck, and that eliminates moral responsibility. Now, that does, of course, bring up this issue of the possibility of being responsible even with indeterminism. And on Kane's behalf, and I'm sure he would prefer to speak for himself than have me say something, but in the self-forming actions that Kane described, it did seem like he provided some examples where somebody could be morally responsible, that could happen even when indeterminism is present. So he gave several examples, like a math problem that someone is working on in a distracting environment and still succeeds, so that person still deserves credit. An assassin who may fail to assassinate somebody because of a possible twitch in his hand, but the hand doesn't twitch and he succeeds in assassinating. So it was a chance of, not, I shouldn't say chance, it was indeterministic, of course, whether he would succeed or not, but he still seems morally responsible for the assassination. And likewise, with an example of a husband trying to break a table, a businesswoman somewhat torn between getting to a meeting on time and helping someone in distress. She has motives to do both things. It's indeterminate which one she's going to do, but Kane argues the motive ultimately is from her. And if she stops to help the person, she's forming her character in a positive way. So it seems like, this comes down to the issue of whether or not you can be morally responsible in the presence of indeterminism. Kane says yes. Strawson obviously says no. A third response that Strawson considers is an existentialist response. And the existentialists might say something like this: except that one can't be held morally responsible for one's character or personality or motivational structure, whatever might be included in what Strawson is calling one's nature, whether or not determinism is true. So Strawson suggests that this is the path that an existentialist such as Sartre might go, but then go on to say, but you can have free will and moral responsibility because one's true self is independent of one's character, personality, motivational structure. You are radically free. You can act in a way that goes maybe against your character, personality, or motivational structure, says the existentialist. That's the idea. And if that's the case, the second step of the basic argument is false. That step being, to be truly responsible for what you do, you must be truly responsible for having your nature. It doesn't matter what your nature is, according to the existentialist, it says you're acting out of your self, your true self. And so you can sidestep the problem that way. Now, Strawson responds by saying, wait a minute, you still need to be truly responsible for yourself if you're going to be morally responsible for what you do. But then we can start the regress argument on the self. So it's just, we apply the same strategy of the regress argument that he's provided, and we just apply it to the self. And Strawson thinks that the existentialist has not provided a way out. So that's Strawson on why he thinks that moral responsibility is impossible, that we should not praise or blame or punish anyone.